Hello, everybody. Bill Lee and I are here with you with the NGA Pandemic and Disaster Response Task Force. Asa Hutchinson, our Vice Chairman, I'm really pleased that you're here to join us as well. Look, for most of the last year and a half, our group has been focused mainly on the pandemic. But today, there's another type of virus that is creating havoc in our IT systems, and we want to talk about the cyber situation, what that means to our states, what that means to our businesses, and what we should be working on a regional basis. And that's why we have Secretary of Homeland Security to help us take the lead on a federal level. I can tell you here from the state of Connecticut side, we've appointed over the last year and a half our first commissioner of cybersecurity, somebody with vast IT experience coming out of the private sector. It's getting more complicated. We have a lot of old legacy systems. Good news is that any hack would just be limited to that particular legacy system. Bad news is these systems didn't talk to each other. So they're all being replaced and upgraded with a more cloud-based system, which allows information to travel back and forth across state government, also allows the virus to go back and forth. Because it's not proprietary, it's a lot easier for us to do electronic patching and try and stay ahead of the cyber criminals. But look, with quantum computing out there, they're getting faster and more sophisticated every day, and we're struggling to keep up. And that's what this forum is all about today. And could not be happier to have the Secretary of Homeland Security, who Governor Bill Lee from Tennessee, please introduce.
Well, thank you, Governor. And I will introduce Secretary Mayorkas in just a second. I would just add a couple words to what you said about the importance of this to all of us. We've all experienced some level of it. In Tennessee, for example, we had the Colonial Pipeline incident along with a lot of other states that just shows us the vulnerabilities that exist and the impact to our people that can occur with just one attack like this. There are great vulnerabilities. We're all working really hard to understand them. The partnership with the federal government, with private providers, the partnerships that are out there to provide us resources are very important. And our understanding as leaders of territories and states and localities as well, our ability to understand the resources that are available to us, that's part of what this talk is about, to open up a greater understanding for all of us. It's how we can tap into these resources, how we can work together, how we can share best practices, and how we can protect ourselves even greater going forward. So Secretary Mayorkas has a long history in his career with these issues, specifically with cybersecurity. So we're grateful for his expertise. And I will go ahead and give you the floor and ask you to lead us in some comments. And then there's going to be Q&A as well. So anyone on the call that is interested in asking questions, kind of line those questions up. We're going to have time for it in just a few minutes. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Governor, for the introduction. And thanks to all of you for giving me the time. I think I would be remiss if I didn't give special recognition to Governor Hutchinson, who is a alumnus of the Department of Homeland Security and whose legacy is something that we've been very proud, quite frankly, to continue into the future and build upon. So I wanted to mention that at the very outset. I have with me three important individuals whom I'd like to introduce. Hopefully you will know their names even better as the days and weeks progress. To my right is Tim Moorer, the Senior Counselor for Cybersecurity in the Office of the Secretary. Brandon Wales, the Acting Director of our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, who's been doing an extraordinary job in leading our department's cybersecurity efforts, and Ava Malona, who is our new Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs, who will ensure that our partnership is lived on a day-to-day basis. You know, there's no, there's that saying that we should never waste a crisis in order to make substantial progress. And I know that the Colonial Pipeline breach really galvanized the public's attention in an unprecedented way, because people thought that one of their basic commodities was threatened, their ability to, frankly, fill their gas tanks and address their fuel needs was jeopardized with the attack. And we saw the lines in gas stations and the like. But I'd like to identify another breach that was fortunately not successful, that really should have gripped the nation. And that was a cyber attack against a water facility, a water treatment facility in Florida. And I cite it because its intent was not to gain a profit, not to make money, but to actually intervene in the treatment of the water and have that treatment facility deliver to its resident consumers water that was untreated, dangerous to the consumer's health, and could have cost thousands of lives. And it was the success, or I should say the failure of the cyber attack that kept that from the public's consciousness, which is something for which we are very grateful. But the attempt should have galvanized the entire country's attention. I think everyone on this call knows that we have to take cybersecurity so very seriously. I have identified it as one of our most urgent priorities in the Department of Homeland Security. And I would say that we have three vectors of activity together that we need to embark upon. One is, quite frankly, for all of you to ensure that the resources of your respective states are invested in addressing this. Two is our support to you and in your efforts. And I'll talk in a moment about what we at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, can do. And the third is, frankly, just the cooperation, the combination of the first two. We are working very closely with the National Chamber of Commerce, with the Small Business Administration, with chambers of commerces and SBAs and community organizations all around the country to raise the visibility of this threat and to communicate some of the most basic blocking and tackling that needs to be done to raise the defense bar. And while some of that blocking and tackling is rather routine and ordinary and easily accessible, its impact should not be minimized. Because what we do in raising that bar is we shrink the community of attackers that can actually succeed. And that's what this is all about. Because with enough resources, with enough time, the very sophisticated are going to get through. We just have to shrink the world of attack exponentially at this point. And so it's a question of not only how to reach those organizations, but also how to reach the ordinary consumer, given, I think, what one of you mentioned at the very outset, the interconnectedness, the increasing interconnectedness of all of us, through the Internet of Things, through, we say in the cyber realm, we're only as strong as our weakest link because of that interconnectedness. We really have to raise that bar in each and everyone's homes when they have some device of connectivity. And we want to work with you on that. Secondly, we have a tremendous amount of support that we could provide. Of course, we have now increased the amount of funding through our FEMA grants that must be dedicated to cybersecurity. We increased that to a total of approximately $77 million. We very well may increase that again next year, but many of the FEMA grant funds obviously pass through the auspices of the governors. And so whether additional FEMA grant funds should be dedicated to this mission set is a prerogative and authority that you yourselves have, and we defer to your judgment in assessing the needs within your states. But we ask or we offer CISA's resources and capabilities to assist you. We have teams that respond to events. We share information from events all over the country with participants in our information sharing architecture. We can provide utilities and critical infrastructure with very important best practices, and we can do assessments and provide recommendations with respect to the strengthening of their infrastructure. And then I think lastly, if we do this together, I think we can really raise the bar.
Say that we've got three broad thrusts of activity going on right now. The first is mostly an inside the government work. We like to say we're getting our own house in order in the wake of the large scale cyber compromise by Russian intelligence actors last year. You'll know it as SolarWinds. We're doing a lot of work to strengthen our own cybersecurity, but importantly, we're also looking at how we can utilize the federal government's procurement power to better shape the marketplace for software and hardware development to improve the cybersecurity posture of those companies so that the supply chains, including the ones that state and locals and private sector companies rely upon, are stronger. Second, as a result of some of the activity that we've seen, including the Florida water incident that Secretary Mayorkas mentioned, there's a greater push for improving the security of critical infrastructure sectors, particularly those that rely upon industrial control systems, and where disruptions could have really catastrophic effects on the country. The White House has been leading an effort, initially starting in the electricity sector, moving on to natural gas pipelines, and we'll move on to others. Inside the department, we have our own sprints focusing on this exact issue. So paying more attention to industrial control system and critical infrastructure cybersecurity, and seeing what additional tools we can bring to bear to improve, to make dramatic improvements in that area. And then the third, obviously in the face of the significant ransomware incidents that we have seen over the past several months, we need to do more to raise the cybersecurity baseline of government and private sector companies across the country. Part of that is on our work to try to raise awareness, to put out the right types of best practices, to highlight areas where there are bad practices that we're too often seeing that need to be stopped. And so what we're concerned about is you can follow a lot of our best practices, but if you're still utilizing some of these bad practices, that is all an adversary needs to compromise your system. So doing a lot more on raising awareness and also trying to use other levers. For example, working with the cyber insurance industry to see that the role that they play in helping to create due diligence standards for the companies and governments that they insure, to try to change the culture of cybersecurity much more broadly. When you think about the attack surface from ransomware, they could literally go after any business, any government entity. It doesn't matter how small or how big, everyone is a target. And so if we want to combat that threat, there's a lot more that we need to do to raise the national level baseline in cybersecurity. And that pairs with broader work that is now happening across the US government on things that we need to do to tackle this problem from a law enforcement perspective, from an intelligence perspective, trying to disrupt the financial flows in digital currency to these criminal organizations, diplomatic channels, et cetera. We know that there is a burden on the government to do more to take on the ransomware actors, and we're trying to rise to meet that challenge. It is one that is being discussed at the highest levels of the United States government right now. I think I will stop there. There's obviously a lot of resources that CISA has. There's a lot more that we are trying to push out, and we're working in close coordination with NGA, with many of your state and local officials. And I'll end with just one more small anecdote as the secretary comes in, which is starting last year, we have been working to deploy state cybersecurity coordinators from CISA. So these would be individual cybersecurity experts that we would have located in each of the state capitals, designed to be our primary interface when it comes to cybersecurity coordination and collaboration with our state and local government agencies, and to be a link back to the resources that CISA maintains at the national level. About 2/3 of them are already on board. We're still working through the hiring process to get the rest of them. If your state CIOs and CISOs may already know them. In some cases, we may have actually hired your former CISOs to take over those jobs. But the goal is to have really close connectivity with the state level leadership, and then work in collaboration with state leadership to push down cybersecurity into your cities and counties throughout your states. There's a lot more work to do there. We saw from the work that we did during the 2020 election that we can have a real impact on the ground at the state and local level. And we want to replicate that for cybersecurity issues much more broadly.
Can I, and I apologize, I had to run out, but if I can add something, and hopefully I'm not treading over ground that Brandon already covered. But we're very focused on our field presence. I know that Brandon mentioned the advisors. We are looking at our out years now and how we can actually build an even greater permanent physical presence for CISA in each of your states. And one thing that's very important to underscore that distinguishes CISA from other government agencies, such as our own Secret Service, quite frankly, and the FBI. And that is that when CISA is called upon to provide its resources, it is not an agency that drives to accountability. In other words, it is not interested in apprehending the bad actor, identifying and apprehending the bad actor for ultimate disposition in a court of law, but rather is an agency of prevention, remediation, resilience, and the like. And so it poses a very different picture for the private sector entity within your jurisdictions, for example, that may have had a cyber attack and that may be hesitant to call the government in, because once you call in the FBI, you may not be able to get them out. But CISA is very different. It's all about the work together to identify the threat vector, if in fact an attack has occurred, to expel the bad actor, to patch, and to build a stronger structure. And I think that's a very important distinguishing feature about CISA that presents a very different federal government partner, quite frankly.
That's very helpful from our point of view. At this point, we may want to open up to a few questions, if that's okay, Mr. Secretary.
Please.
Bill or Asa, would you like to kick things off, or?
I would be happy to, Bill, unless you want to go first.
No, feel free, go ahead.
Either way.
First of all, just following up on the CISA, And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your comments. I'm very proud of that history at Homeland Security, and I know what a tough job that you have, and my admiration is for you and your team for the responsibilities and the work that you have in front of you. But on CISA, that was really fascinating to me and I see the distinction between the apprehension and prosecution versus the collaboration and partnership with CISA. You know, we had a cyber incident in Arkansas, and we actually brought in the FBI, but once you turn that over to them, it's history. You're never going to hear another thing. You know, a year or 2 years later, you might find out whether they actually prosecuted somebody or not, but the information flow is not good. So I like that distinction and the direction that you're taking that. And then I want to follow up on the funding side, and Mr. Secretary, you addressed that. It's about resources, and you know, I urged the administration, and they listened to me, and tried to make sure that cyber security investments could be a part of the American Rescue Plan spending. But then once it got to the Department of Treasury, they put a little caveat in there that really reduced the usefulness of those funds for cybersecurity investments. And that is, it has to be some relation to COVID. And so that was a little disappointment. And as we look at the future in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's out there, I don't know the level of detail, but I hope that can be hardcore infrastructure projects. I don't know where cybersecurity fits, and where you mentioned, but it was a very modest amount of money coming through FEMA. We'll look at that. That was helpful information, but the states do need flexibility on the money that's flowing, that we can use it for cybersecurity investments. And I think you'll see our partnership grow with CISA from that. So I'll turn it back to you, but I just wanted to make that comment, and you might have a response.
Thank you very much, Governor. I agree with you across the board on the need, when we're talking about building our country's infrastructure, to make sure that cybersecurity is a critical part of that. And I think that, if I may, your advocacy and your colleagues' advocacy on that point would be most welcome. I think I don't think one can bang that drum too loudly. Quite frankly, I think all of us around the table are in complete accord with you, because when we talk about building infrastructure, we're talking about building strong infrastructure. When we're talking about strength, we're talking about its ability to be resilient. And earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, we've lived with those and lived through them and suffered from them. And we're in the midst of a cyber hurricane.
Thank you. Thank you. Good comments. I appreciate it. We'll continue to advocate for that.
And I might add, we are in a hurricane, right? But I think that we would expect that it'll be a hurricane that doesn't stop.
That's right.
And so, not just we shouldn't just be talking about. I think it's important to talk about, and certainly today, what's in the infrastructure funding piece or rescue plan, advocating for those funds to be used in this way, but also really just understanding the long-term relationship, Stafford-like possibilities. What does this look like even beyond this funding package? As we know that this is not going to go away, we need to have a plan that's permanent. So I'm not proposing one. I'm just suggesting that as we think about this, we think about right now and the funding that's out before us, but also really how to have a long-term relationship that establishes the partnerships and the flow of information and the flow of funding that will go well beyond this next funding package.
If I may, I think that's a great point. And I don't know that we have really taken a look at what the new, the sort of the disaster landscape looks like, where cyber fits into that. We're so well, developed when it does come to the natural disasters and the Stafford Act and our other authorities. I don't know that we've taken a look at what would be the cyber analog.
Yeah.
Brandon, what?
This is a subject that we have been working for the past year and worked with OMB last year to put a small pilot funding in our FY22 budget that's now being considered by the House and the Senate appropriators. The OMB agreed to a $20 million, what they're calling cyber response and recovery fund.
Yeah.
That we could use to surge support in the face of significant cyber incidents. Now, obviously, $20 million is a very small amount of money, considering the scale of some of the disruptions and remediation costs for some of the significant cyber incidents that cities and states have faced, like major ransomware incidents that happened in Baltimore and Atlanta and others. But it was designed to be a start to demonstrate the efficacy of a program like this. But I do think it begs the question of how do you expand that in a way that makes sense? How do we create the right incentives? We think, and in Secretary Mayorkas' first speech on cyber, he called for a dedicated cybersecurity preparedness grant program, much like you believe is necessary. And so we think those are good to be paired together. Have a grant program that's designed to build the baseline level of cybersecurity across the country for our states and our communities, and then pair that with a cyber response and recovery fund that'll be that insurance policy. Should we have a catastrophic incident, we have the resources to quickly surge support and support states. And Senator Peters got legislation through the Senate to actually authorize the program, and that would create more of a Stafford-like function where it would be able to reimburse states if you were to utilize your, for example, state National Guard units. We can reimburse you from that fund. That legislation has not passed the House, so we don't know where it will end up. But this is something that is active right now. There's a lot of discussions on this on the Hill. And obviously your voice matters in this debate, and it's one that we're still working through.
Let me ask a question to pick up on this, because I'm, of course, aware of the grant programs, which is a little bit of I took it a little bit differently, than your sort of look at the ecosystem, if you will, writ large. What happens if a small city, a rural town, gets hit by a cyber attack, and it really could cripple the flow of electricity in that small town? I say that because we've seen sheriff's offices, police departments, sometimes in a more more populated city, but sometimes in these rural towns get hit. But what are the state resources that you have available? And the question is, in a cyber area, what are the thresholds that need to be met for the government, the federal government, to step in? It's a little bit different than the Stafford Act major, disaster declaration. I think we need to think about that type of, how does one define a disaster? What are the thresholds? And what can we bring to bear financially, as well as, through other resources?
Yeah.
I think we should work on that together.
I think that's a really good question, and actually speaks to the question I had of how do we think about this long term and begin to put in place those kind of plans. We had, if you remember, on Christmas we had a bombing in Nashville, and it's not cybersecurity attack, but it had a similar impact in that it was adjacent to a data center for AT&T, and so we
Right.
had this massive shutdown of communications all over the state, or at least in a major part of our state, and it makes me think about what does constitute a cybersecurity disaster, and how could we work on the determinations of that so that we can have an in-place structure for a place for states to turn, because that's one of the things that states have said to us, even as I've talked to other governors about this. People don't really know what's available or how to respond to the federal government, or at least interact with the federal government on an attack like this. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. What are the resources available for us, and at what point does it become a federal disaster?
Yep. So we'll be rolling out a relatively short order in days, not weeks. I think some very helpful public information avenues, so that we make more accessible the, what if, what to do, how to do it. A repository of information, if you will. But the thing that distinguishes one of the distinguishing features in the definition of a cyber disaster is that an attack in one locale can really have behavioral impacts elsewhere. We saw this in Colonial Pipeline, and it could really impact consumer behavior in a more widespread way than the geography of the attack itself. And I think we have to take that into consideration. I think this is a great point, Governor. We're gonna focus on this.
Right.
And sir, I think one of the other points that you raised implicit in there is what is the playbook when we have one of these significant incidents, particularly for small governments, counties, et cetera, that don't necessarily have strong depth of resources to respond? What do the playbooks look like? And I think that's something that we can take on to work with at the state level. What does the playbook look like? How do they engage with state level capabilities? How do they engage with federal level capabilities? And how do we all come together to provide support to them?
And if I may add two specific points to that, Governor, to your point about the thresholds and the Secretary's point, a lesson learned on our end in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline incident was, what is the transition from the cyber incident to an impact that is non-cyber? So over the weekend, while it was still a cyber incident, by Monday, here within the department, it had flipped and had focused on CBP and FEMA with respect to the Stafford Act and our other capabilities at the department, and where those transition points and how to think through those, which goes to the playbook point. And then second, in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline incident, we issued a new security directive through TSA and now require reporting within 12 hours of incidents. And there was some pushback on the tight reporting of 12 hours. But the reason for that was that in the immediate aftermath of the incident, our concern very quickly became the public's reaction to the reporting of the incident and a potential run on the gas station that was disconnected from the actual impact of the incident. So for us as decision makers and you in your respective roles, the communications aspect and how the population will actually respond became a key aspect, which is why that short reporting requirement came to pass, so that we would have visibility, to reiterate the Secretary's point.
It's a good point you make, thinking about that and the response that the public has. I spoke with a neighboring governor at the onset of the Colonial Pipeline, and part of our conversation was declaring an emergency or not, because of the impact that declaring an emergency has on the public's perception
Right.
of what's happening. So, communicating what was happening with the Colonial Pipeline incident was really important with regard to the run on the pumps. And so as we think through a protocol or the points at which we make decisions, going forward, we ought to think that through.
Yep.
Let me just add, Mr. Secretary, if I could, I mean, let's focus a little bit on prevention. We're talking a lot about what we do after disaster. I mean, here, I can talk for a small state like Connecticut. The CISA coordinator is very interesting to me. I'd love to have a better sense of best practices, what you see elsewhere. I'd love to have some experts come and actually do an audit of our system and compare notes about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and help me compare that to our coordination with our electric utilities and our neighboring states. Perhaps you have consultants and others who you think are really good that you've seen work elsewhere. Some of that I think would be very helpful for at least some of the states that only have 4 or 5 people in our hit squad that goes out there. What happens in a small town right now, if we get hit, I send out the hit squad. We work with Eversource and neighboring electric powers, and we're a little bit making it up as we go, seeing what the segment is. I'd love to get a set of protocols from you that you think have worked elsewhere.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to put a resource guide for governors together. In terms of the capabilities that we have, contact sheets with respect to our people present in your respective jurisdictions, and to include substantive information with respect to best practices. We'll put a resource guide together.
Very helpful. Thank you.
And then we will be extraordinarily eager to deploy our teams to do those assessments and to help you with best practices and the like, because we're very focused on business development in the following, towards the following end, really. If business A or entity A in Connecticut gets hit, and we have that information, we know that a copycat event can occur. These are harms that are easily replicated. And so what we can do is then take what we see from hit A and share information with entities B through Z and say, listen, this is what happened. This is what you need to do so you are not subject to the very same attack. And so that's the way we raise the defense bar for everybody, is when one gives us information, we can disseminate to many. And the more we do that, the stronger we all become. And we're very focused on business development with that objective in mind.
Bill or Mary, are there any other questions? We can monopolize the Secretary's attention forever.
Believe me, I would love to stay and talk about this issue a lot more than some other issues that consume my time.
Well, we actually, this session is due to end here in a minute or two. So there is a lot. I hope it's been helpful to the folks on the call. It certainly has been for me. We have a lot of work to do going forward as we really all understand how it is that we can efficiently communicate what this partnership, not just the partnership of the folks on the line, but our private partners and communities and municipalities, how it is that we can coordinate response and how it is that we can coordinate work on the front end to prevent. This is going to be increasingly important. It's going to be increasingly a part of what our jobs are going forward. And I think this has been particularly helpful to talk about some of the things that we need to get done. So I will wrap it up just by saying thank you, Mr. Secretary, and your team for this. Thank you as well for your plan to really create a strategy for us in leadership in territories and states going forward. We want to develop that plan with you, and I feel confident that's going to happen.